Imagine the most powerful army of the ancient world, 900 iron chariots crushing everything in their path for 20 years. Now imagine them being defeated by a strategy so unexpected, so impossible, that even today it seems like fiction. Meet Deborah, not a king, not a general, but a woman whose courtroom was under a tree. When God whispered his battle plan to her, it defied every rule of warfare. She would convince a terrified commander, gather 10,000 farmers against professional soldiers, and watch heaven itself join the fight. But the most shocking twist? The enemy's greatest weapon would become their death trap, and the final victory blow would come from the last person anyone expected. This isn't just ancient history. It's proof that when God fights, the impossible becomes inevitable. After Joshua died, something terrible happened to God's chosen people. They forgot all about the Lord who had brought them out of Egypt and given them the promised land. Instead of worshiping the one true God, they started bowing down to the false gods of their neighbors, gods made of wood and stone that couldn't see, hear, or help anyone. The Bible tells us in Judges chapter 4, verse 1, "Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead." This wasn't the first time Israel had turned away from God, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. They kept making the same mistake over and over again, forgetting the God who loved them and chasing after things that seemed more exciting. Because of their disobedience, God decided to teach his people a hard lesson. Judges 4:2 explains exactly what happened. "So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, lived in Harosheth Hagoyim." This wasn't just bad politics or unfortunate circumstances. God himself allowed these enemies to rule over Israel because his people had broken their promises to him. King Jabin ruled from his fortress city of Hazor, but the real terror came from his military commander, Sisera. This man was absolutely ruthless and seemed to enjoy making life miserable for the Israelites. He had at his command something that made him nearly unstoppable, an army equipped with iron chariots that struck fear into everyone who saw them. The Bible tells us in verse 3 that Sisera had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. These weren't ordinary wooden chariots pulled by horses. These were war machines covered with iron plates, making them like ancient tanks rolling across the battlefield. When people heard the thunder of iron wheels on stone roads, they ran for their lives. For 20 long years, this oppression continued. 20 years of fear, 20 years of suffering, 20 years of wondering if God had completely forgotten about them. Mothers couldn't let their children play safely outside. Fathers couldn't travel to neighboring towns without risking their lives. Merchants stopped trading because the roads were too dangerous. The simple joys of daily life disappeared under the shadow of Canaanite rule. Travel became so dangerous that people only moved in large groups or at night. Farmers had to work their fields in fear, never knowing when Sisera's soldiers might sweep down and steal their crops or burn their homes. Young men lived in constant worry that they might be captured and forced to work as slaves. Young women feared even worse fates at the hands of enemy soldiers. The sound of those iron chariots became the soundtrack of Israel's nightmare. Day and night the people could hear them rolling through their villages, a constant reminder that they were prisoners in their own promised land. What should have been a place of blessing and peace had become a place of terror and despair. But even in this darkness, God was watching. He heard every cry of his suffering people. He saw every tear that fell. He knew exactly when the right moment would come to act. The Israelites didn't know it yet, but their deliverance was already being prepared in heaven. The suffering Israel experienced under Canaanite rule wasn't just random bad luck or the result of political changes. It was divine justice, God's way of disciplining his people for breaking the covenant they had made with him. When their ancestors had stood at Mount Sinai, and later when they entered the Promised Land, They had made solemn promises to worship only the Lord and follow his ways, but those promises had been forgotten and broken. Instead of staying faithful to the God who had performed incredible miracles to save them from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites had turned to worship Baal, Asherah, and other false gods of the Canaanites. These gods promised easy prosperity, good harvests, and pleasure without the moral demands that came with following the true God. The people had forgotten the amazing things God had done for them. They forgot how he had sent 10 plagues on Egypt to force Pharaoh to let them go. They forgot how he had parted the Red Sea so they could escape on dry ground, while Pharaoh's army drowned behind them. They forgot how he had provided manna from heaven every morning for 40 years in the wilderness, and how he had brought water from rocks when they were thirsty. They forgot how the walls of Jericho had fallen at the sound of their trumpets, and how God had made the sun stand still so Joshua could win a complete victory over their enemies. All these incredible memories had faded as they became comfortable in their new land and started looking at their pagan neighbors with envy instead of gratitude toward God. The false gods they chose to worship were nothing but carved images of wood overlaid with gold and silver. Isaiah 44 would later describe such idols perfectly. They had eyes but could not see, ears but could not hear, mouths but could not speak. They were powerless to help anyone, yet Israel chose them over the living God who had demonstrated his power in ways no one could deny. God's anger burned against this betrayal, but his anger was not like human anger that seeks revenge. It was the righteous anger of a loving father whose children were destroying themselves with foolish choices. He allowed Israel's enemies to oppress them, not because he stopped loving them, but because he loved them too much to let them continue down a path that would ultimately destroy them. Even in his discipline, God's mercy remained. He didn't abandon Israel completely or destroy them as he could have done. Instead, he allowed them to experience the natural consequences of turning away from him. Life without his protection became hard, dangerous, and filled with fear. He was waiting for them to realize that life without God was no life at all. The 20 years of oppression served as a constant reminder that the gods they had chosen to worship instead of the Lord were completely powerless to help them. Baal couldn't stop Sisera's iron chariots. Asherah couldn't protect their families from violence. All the false gods combined couldn't give them even one day of peace or safety. Only when they truly understood this would they be ready to cry out to the Lord for salvation. But God's heart was always ready to forgive. Like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, he was watching and waiting for his children to come home. All they needed to do was acknowledge their sin, turn away from their false gods, and call on his name with sincere hearts. The door to restoration was always open. In the midst of these dark 20 years, God was preparing someone very special to help his people. Her name was Deborah, and she would become one of the most remarkable leaders in Israel's history. The Bible introduces her to us in Judges 4:4 with these simple but powerful words. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. The word prophetess might sound strange to our modern ears, but it simply meant that Deborah was someone God chose to speak through. When the Lord had important messages for his people, he would give those messages to Deborah, and she would share them with Israel. This was an incredible honor and responsibility that very few people in history have ever received. What made Deborah so special wasn't her family background, her education, or her social status. It was her heart. She truly loved God with all her being and wanted to obey him completely. When he spoke to her, she listened carefully with full attention. When he gave her messages for the people, she delivered them exactly as he had given them to her, not adding her own opinions or leaving out parts she might personally disagree with. Being a prophetess in those days was not an easy job. Many people claimed to speak for God when they really didn't. False prophets were everywhere, telling people what they wanted to hear instead of what God actually said. But Deborah was different. When she said something would happen, it really did happen. When she gave advice based on what God had told her, it always worked out exactly as she predicted. Word began to spread throughout the land about this woman who seemed to have a direct connection to heaven. In a time when most people had forgotten how to hear from God, when the priests had become corrupt and the people had turned to false gods, Deborah's clear communication with the Lord stood out like a bright light in deep darkness. She wasn't like the male judges who had led Israel before her. Most of them had been chosen because they were strong warriors or skilled politicians. Deborah's authority came from a completely different source: her intimate relationship with God and her ability to hear His voice clearly. This made her leadership unique and powerful in ways that human strength or political cunning never could be. People began to notice that Deborah's prophecies always came true. If she said it would rain, it rained. If she said someone would be healed, they were healed. If she warned about danger coming, the danger always appeared exactly as she had predicted. Her track record was perfect because she never spoke her own thoughts. She only repeated what God had revealed to her. In a nation that had almost forgotten what it meant to walk with God, Deborah became a living reminder of what that relationship could look like. She showed Israel that God was still there, still speaking, still caring about His people, even though they had wandered far from Him. Through her, they could see that the Lord hadn't given up on them completely. Her rise to prominence wasn't the result of political ambition or military conquest. She didn't fight her way to the top or manipulate circumstances to gain power. Instead, people naturally began coming to her because they recognized that she had something they desperately needed: a genuine connection to the God of their fathers, the God who could still work miracles and change impossible situations. Deborah didn't set up her court in a grand palace or impressive building like other rulers of her time. Instead, she chose to hold court under a palm tree in the hill country, and this simple outdoor setting became the most important place in all of Israel. The Bible tells us exactly where in Judges 4:5. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. The location was perfect for several reasons. First, it was positioned right between two well-known cities, Ramah and Bethel, making it easy for people from all over Israel to find. The hill country of Ephraim was centrally located, so people from both the northern and southern tribes could reach it without too much difficulty. Unlike the closed doors and guarded entrances of royal palaces, anyone could approach Deborah under her tree. The palm tree itself became famous throughout the land. It was called the Palm of Deborah, and just mentioning that name would tell people exactly where you meant. This wasn't just any random tree. It became a symbol of hope and justice for oppressed people everywhere. Under its shade, fairness ruled instead of favoritism, and God's wisdom was available to anyone who needed it. Day after day, people made the journey to seek Deborah's judgment. Some came with complicated disputes between neighbors about property boundaries or business deals gone wrong. Others brought family conflicts that needed wise guidance to resolve. Farmers came when someone had stolen their livestock. Merchants came when trading partners had cheated them. The problems were as varied as human nature itself. What made Deborah's court different from any other court in the land was that she didn't make decisions based on who could pay the biggest bribe or which family had the most political influence. She listened to both sides of every dispute carefully, prayed for God's wisdom, and then gave judgments that were truly fair and right. Her decisions brought peace where there had been conflict and restored relationships that had been broken by misunderstandings or selfishness. People traveled for days just to bring their problems to the palm of Deborah. Word had spread that this was a place where justice could actually be found, where the poor would be treated fairly alongside the rich. where God's wisdom was available to help solve even the most complicated situations. For many Israelites living under Canaanite oppression, Deborah's court was the only place they could find real help. The setting, under an open sky, beneath the branches of a living tree, somehow seemed perfect for the kind of justice Deborah provided. There were no intimidating walls or formal ceremonies to make people nervous about approaching her. The natural setting reminded everyone that the God who made the trees and the hills was the same God whose wisdom was being shared through his servant Deborah. As time went on, the palm of Deborah became more than just a courthouse. It became a symbol of hope. When people throughout Israel felt overwhelmed by injustice or confused about difficult decisions, they would think of that tree and remember that there was still a place where God's truth could be found. Even if they never made the journey themselves, knowing that such a place existed gave them comfort. Visitors to Deborah's court often left with more than just solutions to their immediate problems. They had experienced what it was like to receive counsel from someone who truly walked with God. They had seen firsthand that the Lord was still active in Israel, still caring about the daily struggles of his people, still willing to provide wisdom and guidance to those who sought it with sincere hearts. Being Israel's judge during such a difficult time meant that Deborah carried enormous emotional and spiritual weight on her shoulders every single day. As people came to her court from all over the nation, she heard story after story of suffering under Canaanite rule. Each tale of injustice, fear, and desperation added to the heavy burden she felt for her people's welfare. Families would come to her with tears in their eyes, telling how Sisera's soldiers had stolen their grain right before harvest time, leaving them with nothing to feed their children through the winter. Young women would whisper their fears about traveling alone, knowing that enemy soldiers roamed the roads looking for victims. Elderly men would share their heartbreak over sons who had been taken away to work as forced laborers in Canaanite cities. But as painful as it was to hear about the physical suffering of her people, what hurt Deborah's heart even more was seeing their spiritual condition. Israel had completely lost their sense of identity as God's chosen people. They had forgotten what made them different from all the other nations on earth. Instead of being a light to the world, showing what it looked like when people truly followed the Lord, they had become just like everyone else around them. The people who came to her court had forgotten the amazing stories of their ancestors. They didn't remember how God had called Abraham out of a pagan land and promised to make his descendants into a great nation. They had forgotten about the miraculous exodus from Egypt, when God had demonstrated his power through 10 incredible plagues. They couldn't recall how he had provided for them in the wilderness and brought them into the promised land flowing with milk and honey, instead of teaching their children about the one true God who had done all these wonderful things. Many parents were taking them to worship at the shrines of Baal and Asherah. Instead of following God's laws about treating the poor with kindness and fairness, they had adopted the selfish ways of their pagan neighbors. Instead of being known for their integrity and compassion, they had become known for the same corruption and cruelty that characterized all the other nations. This spiritual blindness was more dangerous than any army with iron chariots because it was destroying Israel from the inside out. External enemies could only harm their bodies and take their possessions, but turning away from God was damaging their very souls. Deborah could see that even if Sisera disappeared tomorrow, Israel would still be in terrible danger as long as they remained disconnected from their true source of life and strength. Every person who came to the palm of Deborah reminded her of how much work needed to be done. It wasn't enough to just solve individual disputes and problems. The whole nation needed to remember who they were supposed to be and reconnect with the God who had made them his special treasure among all the peoples of the earth. This was a task far too big for any human being to accomplish alone. Yet Deborah didn't become discouraged or give up. She trusted that the same God who had called her to be a prophetess and judge was also able to heal the hearts of his people. She believed that he could restore Israel's spiritual sight and help them remember their true identity as his beloved children. Her faith remained strong even when the problems seemed overwhelming. The burden of leadership also meant that Deborah had to make difficult decisions about when to speak hard truths that people didn't want to hear. Sometimes people came to her court hoping she would tell them what they wanted to hear rather than what God actually said. But as his faithful messenger, she had to deliver his words regardless of whether they were popular or comfortable. One day, as Deborah was spending time in prayer and listening for God's voice, as she did every morning, the Lord gave her a message that would change everything. The revelation was clear and specific. The time of Israel's suffering under Canaanite rule was about to end. After 20 long years of oppression, God was ready to set his people free once again. This wasn't just wishful thinking on Deborah's part or an attempt to encourage people with false hope. This was a direct communication from the God of Israel, the same God who had delivered their ancestors from slavery in Egypt and brought them into the Promised Land. He was about to act on behalf of his people in a mighty way that would remind everyone of his power and faithfulness. But the victory wouldn't come in the way anyone might naturally expect. God revealed to Deborah that this wouldn't be won through superior military strategy, better weapons, or larger armies. Israel didn't have any of those advantages anyway. Sisera's 900 iron chariots made him seem invincible from a human perspective. This battle would be won through faith, obedience, and complete dependence on the Lord's supernatural intervention. The revelation showed Deborah that God was looking for people who would trust him enough to follow his battle plan even when it seemed impossible or foolish to human thinking. He wanted leaders who would obey his commands, even when those commands didn't make sense from a military standpoint. This would be a victory that could only be explained by divine power, so that everyone would know the Lord had fought for Israel. God made it clear that this deliverance would require courage from his people. They had spent 20 years living in fear, running and hiding from their enemies. Now they would need to stand up and fight, but not in their own strength. They would need to step out in faith and trust that the same God who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho could also defeat Sisera's iron chariots. The timing of this revelation was perfect, even though Deborah probably didn't understand all the reasons why God had waited exactly 20 years to act. Those 2 decades of suffering had served their purpose. They had shown Israel that life without God's protection was miserable and dangerous. They had demonstrated that the false gods they had chosen to worship were completely powerless to help them when real trouble came. More importantly, the years of hardship had prepared the hearts of at least some Israelites to cry out to the true God for salvation. The pain had stripped away their pride and self-sufficiency, making them ready to acknowledge their need for divine help. God always knows the perfect moment to move, and that moment was finally approaching. The revelation also showed Deborah that she would play a crucial role in this coming deliverance. God wasn't just telling her about it so she could sit back and watch from the sidelines. He was calling her to step into the action, to help lead Israel into this miraculous victory. Her faith and obedience would be essential to the success of his plan. This divine message filled Deborah with both excitement and soberness. Excitement because it meant freedom was finally coming for her suffering people. Soberness because she understood the enormous responsibility that was being placed on her shoulders. The words she spoke and the actions she took in the coming days would determine whether Israel experienced God's promised deliverance or remained in bondage for years to come. Even though God had chosen Deborah to be Israel's spiritual leader and judge, he made it clear in his revelation that she would need a military commander to lead the army into battle against Sisera. This wasn't because Deborah couldn't handle the job herself, but because God's plan required different people to play different specific roles in bringing about Israel's deliverance. The Lord showed Deborah exactly who this military commander should be. His name was Barak, and he was the son of Abinoam from the town of Kadesh, located in the territory of Naphtali in northern Israel. This wasn't Deborah's personal choice or her human wisdom selecting someone she thought would be good for the job. This was a direct revelation from God about the man he had already prepared for this crucial moment in Israel's history. Barak was well known throughout the northern tribes as a capable warrior and leader. He had grown up in the region that suffered most severely under Sisera's attacks, so he understood better than almost anyone what the people were enduring. He had seen firsthand the terror that those iron chariots could bring, the way they could roll through villages and devastate everything in their path. His family connections in Naphtali and the surrounding areas would be extremely important for the task ahead. Gathering an army during such dangerous times would require someone who had the trust and respect of the tribal leaders. Barak had those relationships already established through years of proving himself as a man of integrity and courage in his local community. But what made Barak truly suitable for this divine mission wasn't just his military experience or his tribal connections, though both of those were important. God saw something in Barak's heart that made him the right choice, a willingness to trust in the Lord even when circumstances seemed impossible, and the humility to follow God's unusual battle plans instead of relying on conventional military wisdom. The northern tribes where Barak lived had suffered the most under Canaanite oppression. They were the ones who lived closest to Sisera's base of operations and experienced his cruelty most regularly. This meant that Barak and his people had the strongest motivation to fight for freedom, and they would be most willing to take the risks necessary to achieve it. God also knew that Barak would need supernatural courage to face an enemy with 900 iron chariots when his own forces would be mostly farmers and shepherds with basic weapons. Natural bravery wouldn't be enough. He would need the kind of faith-based courage that comes from knowing God is fighting alongside you. The Lord had seen this quality in Barak's character. Another important factor was Barak's location in Kadesh, which was strategically positioned in northern Israel. From there, he could easily communicate with and rally the tribes of Naphtali, Zebulun, and others who would be crucial to assembling the army God wanted. His hometown was perfectly placed for the logistics of organizing this divine military campaign. The fact that God specifically chose Barak by name and gave Deborah detailed information about his family and location proved once again that this entire plan was orchestrated from heaven. Nothing was left to chance or human guesswork. Every detail had been carefully planned by the same God who knew the end from the beginning and could see exactly what would be needed to achieve complete victory over Israel's enemies. As Deborah prepared to summon Barak and deliver God's battle plan to him, she felt the full weight of her calling as a prophetess pressing down on her shoulders. The message she was about to share wasn't just good advice from a wise counselor or the hopeful wishes of someone who wanted to see Israel free. These were direct commands from the God of heaven and earth, and how she communicated them could determine the destiny of an entire nation. She understood that her words carried supernatural power because they came from God himself. When she spoke what the Lord had revealed to her, she wasn't just sharing information, she was releasing divine authority that could change the course of history. The same God who had spoken the universe into existence was now speaking his will through her to accomplish his purposes for his chosen people. If Barak believed her message and obeyed God's commands, Israel would finally be free from 20 years of cruel oppression. Families could live without fear, children could play safely, and the nation could begin to rebuild and prosper again. But if he doubted her words or refused to follow God's unusual battle plan, the people might remain in slavery for many more years to come. Deborah also knew that some people might question her authority to give military commands to a seasoned warrior like Barak. In their culture, it was unusual for a woman to be giving orders to a man, especially about warfare. Some might wonder if she was overstepping her bounds or trying to take on roles that weren't appropriate for her. But she knew that God's calling on her life transcended human traditions and cultural expectations. The stakes couldn't be higher. If this mission failed, it wouldn't just mean continued suffering for Israel. It could also mean that people would lose faith in her prophetic ministry. They might decide that she wasn't really hearing from God after all, and they would stop coming to the palm of Deborah for guidance and justice. Her reputation and effectiveness as God's messenger were on the line, but even more important than her own reputation was the reputation of God himself. If she delivered his message accurately and the plan succeeded, everyone would know that the Lord was still active and powerful on behalf of his people. But if something went wrong, some might blame God rather than recognizing any human failures in carrying out his instructions. She felt the responsibility of representing God well to her entire generation. Yet underneath all these heavy concerns, Deborah had an unshakable confidence that came from her relationship with the Lord. She had heard his voice clearly many times before, and his words had always proven true. She had learned to recognize the difference between her own thoughts and genuine divine revelation. What she had received about Israel's coming deliverance had the unmistakable ring of God's authentic voice. This confidence gave her the courage she needed to move forward despite the enormous responsibility. She knew that the same God who had given her this revelation would also provide everything needed to see it accomplished. Her job was simply to be faithful, to deliver his message exactly as he had given it to her, without adding her own ideas or subtracting anything she might personally find difficult. The time had come to call for Barak and set in motion the events that would lead to Israel's freedom. Deborah took a deep breath and prepared to speak the words that would change everything, knowing that she was about to play her part in one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power that her generation would ever witness. The moment had finally arrived for Deborah to deliver God's battle plan. She knew exactly who the Lord had chosen to lead Israel's army, and she wasted no time in calling for him. Messengers were sent racing through the northern territories with an urgent message. Barak, son of Abinoam, was to come immediately to the palm of Deborah. This wasn't a casual invitation or a polite request. It was a divine summons that couldn't be ignored. When Barak arrived at Deborah's famous palm tree, he found the prophetess waiting with a message that would change his life forever. Her face was serious. Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone speaking for God himself. Without any small talk or gentle preparation, she delivered the Lord's command directly as recorded in Judges 4:6. Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. These weren't Deborah's own ideas about military strategy or her personal suggestions for dealing with the Canaanite problem. Every word came straight from heaven, carrying the full authority of the God who had created the universe and chosen Israel as his special people. When Deborah spoke like this, she wasn't giving advice. She was delivering orders from the highest commander in existence. Barak stood there listening, probably feeling a mix of excitement and terror. Excitement, because this meant God was finally ready to set his people free after 20 long years of suffering. Terror, because he was being asked to lead a battle against an enemy that had never been defeated, an enemy with iron chariots that seemed impossible to overcome. The specificity of God's command was remarkable. Not just any men from any tribes, but exactly 10,000 men from the specific tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. Not just any mountain or hill, but Mount Tabor. God had a precise plan, and every detail mattered. This wasn't going to be a typical war where generals made up strategies. As they went along, this was going to be a supernatural victory, orchestrated entirely by the Lord. Deborah's words carried such power and authority that Barak couldn't doubt she was speaking for God. He had probably heard about her, reputation as a prophetess, how her predictions always came true and her advice always worked out perfectly. Now he was experiencing firsthand what it was like to receive a direct message from heaven through God's chosen messenger. God's battle plan was unlike anything any military commander would have recommended. As Deborah continued explaining the Lord's strategy, every detail revealed divine wisdom that went far beyond human thinking. The plan was both simple enough for anyone to understand and sophisticated enough to guarantee victory against impossible odds. First, Barak was to gather exactly 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. These northern tribes had suffered the most under Sisera's oppression, so they would be the most motivated to fight for their freedom. They knew better than anyone what victory would mean for their families and communities. Their personal experience with Canaanite cruelty would give them the determination needed to follow through with God's unusual battle plan. The location God chose for the battle was Mount Tabor, a prominent hill that rose dramatically from the Jezreel Valley. This wasn't just any random spot. It was a strategic position that would give Israel's army the high ground advantage. From the top of Mount Tabor, they could see for miles in every direction, watching as Sisera deployed his forces in the valley below. But the real genius of God's strategy wasn't just about military positioning. By placing Israel's army on Mount Tabor, the Lord was setting a trap for Sisera's iron chariots. Those massive war machines were Sisera's greatest strength on flat ground, where they could roll freely and strike terror into their enemies. But in the valley below Mount Tabor, they would become a weakness instead of a strength. The plan required Sisera to bring his entire army, including all 900 iron chariots, into the valley where they would be most vulnerable. God knew exactly how to lure the enemy commander into this trap. Sisera's pride and confidence in his iron chariots would make him eager to deploy them where he thought they would be most effective. Never realizing he was walking straight into God's prepared ambush, Mount Tabor itself was symbolic of God's power over the earth. This wasn't just a military base. It was a reminder that the same God who had shaped the mountains and valleys was now positioning his people for victory. Every rock and tree on that mountain belonged to the Lord, and he could use the very landscape itself as a weapon against his enemies. When Barak heard God's battle plan through Deborah, his response revealed both the strength and weakness of his faith. Instead of immediately accepting the mission with complete confidence, he made an unexpected request that would change the entire dynamic of the coming battle. His words are recorded in Judges 4:8. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." This wasn't outright rebellion or cowardice, but it wasn't perfect faith either. Barak believed that God could deliver Israel from their enemies. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been willing to fight at all. But he wasn't completely confident in his own ability to hear God's voice during the heat of battle. He needed Deborah there beside him, serving as a direct link to heaven when quick decisions had to be made. In some ways, Barak's request showed wisdom. He recognized that this wasn't going to be an ordinary military campaign, where success depended on human strategy and strength. This was going to be a supernatural victory that required moment-by-moment guidance from God. If the Lord decided to change the battle plan in the middle of the fight, Barak wanted to make sure he could receive those new instructions clearly, but his condition also revealed a lack of complete trust in God's ability to speak to him directly. The Lord had already chosen him by name and given him specific commands through Deborah. That should have been enough confirmation that God would continue to guide him throughout the mission. By insisting that Deborah accompany him, Barak was essentially saying he didn't fully trust his own connection to God. Barak's request also showed his deep respect for Deborah's prophetic gift. He had seen how accurately she heard from God and how perfectly her predictions came true. He knew that having her present would guarantee that they stayed exactly aligned with heaven's will. This wasn't just about military strategy. It was about maintaining their spiritual connection to the source of their victory. The implications of his condition would extend far beyond the battle itself. By requiring Deborah's presence, Barak was unknowingly setting up a situation where the traditional glory of military conquest would be shared in unexpected ways. God's plan was perfect, but Barak's faith wasn't quite complete, and that small gap would lead to a surprising twist in how the victory would unfold. His response also revealed the pressure he felt as the chosen military leader. Everyone would be looking to him for guidance and courage during the fight. If things went wrong, he would be blamed for the failure. Having Deborah there would help share that enormous responsibility and ensure that God's will was being followed precisely at every moment. Deborah's response to Barak's condition was immediate and carried the weight of divine revelation. She agreed to accompany him into battle, but she also delivered a prophecy that would fundamentally change how this victory would be remembered. Her words in Judges 4:9 were both a promise and a warning. Certainly I will go with you, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. This prophecy wasn't spoken in anger or frustration with Barak's request. Deborah wasn't punishing him for asking her to come along. Instead, she was simply revealing what God had shown her about how events would unfold. The Lord had a specific plan for how this victory would happen, and Barak's condition had just triggered a different aspect of that divine strategy. In their culture, military glory typically belonged to the commanding general who led the army to victory. The man who killed the enemy commander in battle would be celebrated as a hero and remembered in songs and stories for generations. But God's ways are not human ways, and he was about to turn their expectations completely upside down. The prophecy revealed that Sisera, the terrifying commander who had oppressed Israel for 20 years, would indeed be defeated. But he wouldn't die by Barak's sword in a dramatic battlefield confrontation. Instead, the Lord would deliver him into the hands of a woman. This was shocking news in a world where women rarely played direct roles in warfare. Deborah's words carried a deeper meaning about how God chooses to display his power. He delights in using the weak things of the world to shame the strong, the humble to bring down the proud. By having a woman deliver the final blow against Israel's greatest enemy, God would make it crystal clear that this victory came from heaven, not from human military might. The prophecy also served as a gentle correction to Barak's incomplete faith. Since he couldn't trust God to speak to him directly during the battle, the ultimate honor of defeating Sisera would go to someone who would demonstrate complete trust in the Lord's protection and guidance. This wasn't punishment. It was simply the natural consequence of his spiritual condition, but the prophecy contained hope as well as warning. The battle would still be won, Israel would still be freed, and Barak would still lead the army to victory. The only thing that would change was who received the final glory for Sisera's defeat. God's purposes would be accomplished regardless of human weakness or incomplete faith. With God's battle plan clearly understood and Deborah's prophecy delivered, it was time to begin the journey that would lead to Israel's freedom. Together, the prophetess and the military commander traveled north toward Kadesh, Barak's hometown, where the work of assembling God's army would begin. This journey marked the transition from receiving divine revelation to taking concrete action based on what God had revealed. The trip to Kadesh wasn't just about covering physical distance. It was about moving from the world of prophecy into the world of military preparation. Every step brought them closer to the moment when faith would have to be demonstrated through obedient action. They were no longer just talking about what God might do. They were actively participating in making his plan happen. As they traveled, Deborah and Barak had time to discuss the details of what lay ahead. She could explain more fully what God had shown her about the battle, while he could share his knowledge of the northern tribes and how best to rally them for this divine mission. Their different gifts, her spiritual insight and his military experience, would complement each other perfectly. When they arrived in Kadesh, the real work began immediately. Messengers were sent racing throughout the territories of Naphtali and Zebulun with an urgent call to arms. But this wasn't just any military recruitment. This was a call to join God's army for a supernatural victory that would end 20 years of oppression and restore freedom to all Israel. The message carried by these messengers was simple but powerful. The God of Israel had commanded that 10,000 men gather to fight against Sisera and his iron chariots. The prophetess Deborah herself would be there, guaranteeing that this was truly a divine mission rather than a human rebellion. Anyone who joined this army would be fighting alongside the same God who had delivered their ancestors from Egypt. Word spread quickly through villages and farms, carried not just by the official messengers, but by the excited conversations of people who heard the news. After 20 years of living in fear, the possibility of real freedom seemed almost too good to believe. Could it really be true that God was finally ready to act against their oppressors? The response would test not only the organizational skills of Barak and his supporters, but also the spiritual readiness of the people themselves. Were they prepared to trust God enough to leave their homes and families to join a battle against an enemy that had never been defeated? Would they have the faith to follow divine commands even when the odds seemed impossible? Each man who decided to answer the call would have to make a personal choice between safety and faith, between the familiar fear they had lived with for 20 years and the unknown adventure of trusting God for supernatural victory. As the call to arms spread throughout the northern territories, men began making their way toward the gathering place in increasing numbers. Some came immediately, dropping whatever they were doing the moment they heard that God was finally ready to fight for Israel. Others took longer to decide, weighing the risks and trying to determine if this was really a divine mission or just another doomed human rebellion. The men who responded came from all walks of life. There were farmers who left their fields at the busiest time of harvest season. Shepherds abandoned their flocks to join God's army. Craftsmen put down their tools, and merchants closed their shops. What united them all was their shared suffering under Canaanite rule and their desperate hope that freedom might finally be possible. Some arrived with great enthusiasm, their eyes bright with the possibility of seeing their families live without fear for the first time in 20 years. They had heard the stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt and brought them into the promised land. Now they had the chance to experience God's mighty power for themselves, to be part of a miracle that their children and grandchildren would talk about forever. Others came more reluctantly, fully aware of Sisera's terrifying reputation and the power of his iron chariots. They had seen what those war machines could do to anyone who dared to oppose them, but they also knew that staying home wouldn't provide safety if this rebellion failed. At least by joining the fight, they would have some control over their own destiny. Deborah's presence among the gathering army served a crucial purpose. Every time someone arrived and saw her there, they were reminded that this wasn't just Barak's idea or a desperate human scheme. This was a mission commanded by God himself and guided by his chosen prophetess. Her very presence was proof that heaven was behind this apparently impossible undertaking. As the numbers grew, the excitement became contagious. Men who had arrived with doubts found their courage strengthened by seeing so many of their neighbors willing to trust God for victory. Conversations around the campfires were filled with stories of God's past miracles and speculation about how he might choose to defeat Sisera's seemingly invincible army. Barak and his officers worked tirelessly to organize the growing crowd into an effective fighting force. These weren't professional soldiers. Most had never fought in a real battle. They were ordinary men who had been farmers, shepherds, and tradesmen just days before. But they had something that professional armies often lacked. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. The process of reaching exactly 10,000 men was no accident. God had specified this number for reasons that went beyond military strategy. It was large enough to be a real army, but small enough that victory could only be explained by divine intervention. Not superior numbers or better equipment. When the army of 10,000 was finally assembled and organized, the time came to begin the march toward Mount Tabor. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a pilgrimage of faith, a journey that would test every man's commitment to trusting God over their own fears and doubts. Each step away from the safety of familiar territory was a step toward the unknown adventure of divine victory. Deborah rode alongside Barak at the head of the column, her presence serving as a constant reminder of why they were making this march. This wasn't about human ambition or political rebellion. This was about obeying God's direct commands and trusting Him to deliver on His promises. Every time someone looked up and saw the prophetess there, they remembered that heaven itself was backing their mission. As they walked, the conversation naturally turned to the great stories of their ancestors. These men had grown up hearing about how God had parted the Red Sea to let the Israelites escape from Pharaoh's army. They knew the tales of how He had provided manna in the wilderness for 40 years and brought water from rocks when His people were thirsty. They had been told about the walls of Jericho falling at the sound of trumpets and the sun standing still so Joshua could complete his victory. Now, they were about to become part of one of those stories themselves. Their children and grandchildren would someday hear about the day when God defeated Sisera's iron chariots and set Israel free from 20 years of oppression. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. They were walking straight into the pages of history. The march also served as a time of preparation, not just physically, but spiritually. Many of these men had never really trusted God for anything more dramatic than a good harvest or the healing of a sick animal. Now they were being asked to stake their lives on the belief that the same God who had worked miracles for Moses and Joshua was still alive and still willing to fight for His people. Some probably wrestled with doubts during the long hours of walking. What if God had changed His mind? What if Deborah had misunderstood the message? What if Sisera's iron chariots really were as unstoppable as they seemed? But these fears were balanced by the excitement of finally taking action after 20 years of passive suffering. The landscape itself seemed to be encouraging their faith. They were walking through the same hills and valleys, where their ancestors had lived and worshipped God. Every familiar landmark reminded them of their heritage as the chosen people of the Lord. This was their land, given to them by God Himself, and they had every right to fight for its freedom as Mount Tabor came into view on the horizon. Rising majestically above the surrounding valley, the reality of what they were about to attempt began to sink in. From that mountain, they would be able to see Sisera's army deploying in the valley below. Soon, very soon, they would discover whether their faith in God's promises was justified or foolish. When Israel's army finally reached Mount Tabor, they quickly climbed to the heights and took their positions as God had commanded. From this elevated vantage point, they could see for miles across the Jezreel Valley, where Sisera would soon deploy his formidable forces. The view was both inspiring and intimidating. Inspiring because it showed them the strategic advantage of the high ground. Intimidating because it revealed how exposed they would be once the battle began. The contrast between the two armies couldn't have been more dramatic. Israel's 10,000 men were mostly farmers and shepherds, armed with basic weapons and protected by simple armor. They had no iron chariots, no professional military equipment, and no experience fighting against organized armies. What they did have was God's promise of victory and the presence of His prophetess to guide them. Soon, Sisera's army would fill the valley below with a display of military might that had terrorized the region for 20 years. 900 iron chariots would gleam in the sunlight, their metal surfaces reflecting the power and confidence of their Canaanite masters. Professional soldiers would march in perfect formation, their weapons and armor representing the best that human military technology could provide. But from their position on Mount Tabor, Israel's army had something more valuable than iron chariots or professional training. They had the high ground and God's supernatural backing. Every man who looked down into that valley knew that what was about to happen would be decided not by military superiority, but by divine intervention. They were about to witness a battle where heaven itself would join the fight. The positioning on Mount Tabor also had symbolic meaning that went beyond military strategy. Mountains in the Bible often represented places where God revealed himself and demonstrated his power. Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Mount Carmel, where Elijah would later call down fire from heaven. Now, Mount Tabor would become another mountain where the Lord showed his mighty power on behalf of his people. As the soldiers settled into their positions and prepared for battle, they could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. They were about to participate in something that would be remembered for generations, a divine victory that would prove once again that the God of Israel was more powerful than any earthly army or human weapon. The stage was perfectly set for God to demonstrate his power through Israel's obedience. They had followed his commands exactly, gathering the right number of men from the specified tribes and positioning themselves on the mountain he had chosen. Now all that remained was to trust him completely and watch as he fought for them in ways they could never have imagined. When the news reached Sisera that Israel had dared to gather an army on Mount Tabor, he couldn't help but smile with cruel satisfaction. After 20 years of keeping these people in fear, they were finally foolish enough to challenge him directly. This was exactly what he had been hoping for, a chance to crush their rebellion once and for all, and teach them never to dream of freedom again. Sisera immediately began mobilizing his entire military force, with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. His 900 iron chariots were the most feared weapons in the ancient world, like having 900 tanks in a time when everyone else fought on foot with swords and spears. These weren't just transportation. They were mobile fortresses that could roll through enemy lines, crushing everything in their path. The preparation was impressive to watch. Blacksmiths checked every iron plate to make sure the chariots were battle-ready. Horse trainers made certain that every animal was in peak condition for the fight ahead. Soldiers sharpened their weapons and polished their armor until it gleamed in the sunlight. This was going to be a display of military might that would be remembered for generations. As the vast army assembled, Sisera felt the familiar rush of power that came from commanding such an impressive force. He had used these same chariots to terrorize villages throughout Israel, and now he would use them to end any thoughts of rebellion permanently. The sight of his iron chariots rolling across the battlefield would probably cause half of Israel's peasant army to run away before the fighting even began. From Sisera's perspective, this wasn't really going to be a battle at all. It was going to be a massacre. Israel's army consisted of farmers and shepherds with basic weapons, while his forces were professional soldiers equipped with the best military technology available. The outcome was so obvious that he almost felt sorry for the poor fools who had been convinced to join this hopeless cause. The Canaanite commander had no way of knowing that he was walking straight into a trap set by the God of Israel. In his mind, the only God that mattered was military might, and he had more of that than anyone in the region. He had forgotten that the same God who had brought Israel out of Egypt and given them the promised land was still alive and still fighting for his people. As his impressive army began moving toward the Jezreel Valley, Sisera was already planning his victory celebration. He would make this defeat so complete and so brutal that no one in Israel would ever think of rebelling again. But he was about to discover that there are some battles where human strength means nothing at all. From their position on Mount Tabor, Israel's army watched as Sisera's forces deployed across the valley floor below. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. 900 iron chariots gleaming in the sunlight, thousands of professional soldiers moving in perfect formation, horses and riders ready for battle. It looked like the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. But Deborah wasn't watching Sisera's army with fear or doubt. She was listening for the voice of God, waiting for the exact moment when heaven would give the command to attack. This battle wouldn't be won by human timing or military strategy. It would be won by perfect obedience to divine direction. Every second mattered, and she needed to hear clearly from the Lord. Then it happened. As Sisera's forces finished positioning themselves in the valley, Deborah received the final word from God that she had been waiting for. The Lord told her that the moment had arrived. This was the day he had chosen to deliver Sisera into Israel's hands. The waiting was over, and the time for divine action had begun. With the authority of a prophetess speaking directly for God, Deborah turned to Barak and delivered the command that would change everything. Her words are recorded in Judges 4:14. Get up. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? This wasn't a suggestion or encouragement. This was a direct order from heaven itself. The phrase, "Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" carried incredible meaning. It meant that God wasn't just promising to help them in the battle. He was already there in the valley, preparing to fight alongside them. Before the first sword was drawn or the first arrow was shot, the Lord had already taken his position on the battlefield as Israel's champion. This moment marked the transition from human planning to divine action. Up until now, everything had been about preparation, gathering troops, and positioning for battle. But now God himself was entering the fight, and everything that happened next would be supernatural rather than natural, miraculous rather than ordinary. Deborah's words rang out across Mount Tabor with such power and authority that every man in Israel's army could hear them clearly. These weren't the nervous commands of a general hoping for the best. These were the confident declarations of someone who knew with absolute certainty that God had already decided the outcome of this battle. The moment of divine timing had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. At Deborah's command, something amazing happened on Mount Tabor. 10,000 men who had been farmers and shepherds just days before suddenly became God's army, ready to charge down the mountainside into what looked like certain death. Barak led them, and his voice rang out across the heights as he gave the order to attack. The descent from Mount Tabor required incredible faith from every single man in Israel's army. They were leaving their strategic advantage on the high ground to charge straight toward an enemy that had never been defeated. From a human perspective, this looked like suicide running down a hill to fight 900 iron chariots with nothing but basic weapons and cloth armor. But something supernatural was happening in the hearts of these men as they charged. Instead of fear, they felt a strange confidence that came from knowing God was fighting alongside them. Instead of terror at the sight of those iron chariots, they felt excited about seeing what the Lord would do to their enemies. The battle cry didn't sound like desperate men facing certain death. It sounded like victorious warriors celebrating a battle already won. As recorded in Judges 4:14, Barak led his men down from Mount Tabor with the knowledge that the Lord has gone ahead of you. This wasn't just a hopeful thought, it was a divine promise that God was already on the battlefield, preparing to demonstrate his power in ways that would amaze everyone who witnessed it. The charge itself must have been an incredible sight. 10,000 men running down a mountain, their voices united in a battle cry that echoed across the valley, their weapons glinting in the sunlight as they rushed toward what appeared to be impossible odds. To Sisera's army, it probably looked like a mob of crazy farmers who had completely lost their minds. But this wasn't a desperate attack by untrained peasants. This was the army of the living God, moving in perfect obedience to his commands. Every step down that mountain was a step of faith. trusting that the same God who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho was about to do something equally miraculous in the Jezreel Valley. The men charging down Mount Tabor weren't fighting in their own strength or depending on their own weapons. They were instruments of divine judgment, chosen by God to bring his justice to an enemy that had oppressed his people for far too long. What looked like a hopeless attack was actually the beginning of one of the greatest supernatural victories in history. As they reached the bottom of the mountain and prepared to clash with Sisera's forces, every man in Israel's army knew they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. They were charging not as ordinary soldiers, but as participants in a miracle. The moment Israel's army engaged Sisera's forces, something extraordinary began to happen in the natural world around them. The God who controls the weather and commands the elements decided to enter the battle in a way that no one could have expected. What started as a normal sunny day suddenly became a supernatural demonstration of divine power. Dark clouds began gathering overhead with impossible speed, as if the very heavens were preparing to join the fight. Then the rain began. Not just ordinary rain, but torrential downpours that seemed to be aimed specifically at making life miserable for Sisera's iron chariots. Within minutes, the valley floor began turning into a muddy swamp that would trap those heavy war machines like flies in honey. Judges 5:4 describes what happened. When you, Lord, went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. This wasn't just a convenient rainstorm. This was the Lord of hosts personally entering the battle to fight for his people, using the forces of nature as his weapons. The iron chariots that had been Sisera's greatest advantage suddenly became his worst nightmare. These massive war machines had been designed to roll smoothly across firm ground, striking terror into enemy armies with their speed and power. But in the muddy mess that the valley had become, they couldn't move at all. Their iron-covered wheels stuck fast in the thick mud, turning them from mobile weapons into sitting targets. The horses pulling the chariots began to panic as they struggled helplessly in the mire. The harder they tried to move, the deeper the wheels sank into the soft ground. What had been an impressive display of military might just minutes before was now a chaotic scene of trapped chariots and frightened animals, completely unable to function as weapons of war. But the supernatural intervention didn't stop with the rain. Judges 5:20 tells us that from the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. This suggests that cosmic forces beyond human understanding were joining the battle against Israel's enemies. The very universe itself was taking sides in this conflict. The confusion and panic that seized Sisera's army wasn't just the result of tactical problems. It was supernatural chaos sent by God to destroy their ability to fight effectively. Soldiers who had been confident and organized just moments before suddenly couldn't think clearly or follow orders. Their superior training and experience became useless as divine confusion clouded their minds. Meanwhile, Israel's army found themselves fighting with strength and courage that came from heaven itself. Every swing of their swords, every shot of their arrows seemed to be guided by divine power. They were no longer just farmers and shepherds. They had become instruments of God's judgment, unstoppable in their advance against the enemy. What had started as Sisera's confident assault on Israel quickly turned into a complete disaster for the Canaanite forces. As God's supernatural intervention continued, the panic and confusion among their ranks grew worse by the minute. Soldiers who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves helpless against an enemy they had expected to crush without effort. The Bible describes what happened in Judges 1:15. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. This wasn't just a military victory. It was divine judgment being executed through human instruments. Every blow struck by Israel's army carried the power and authority of heaven itself. Professional soldiers who had terrorized the region for 20 years suddenly couldn't fight effectively at all. Their weapons felt heavy in their hands. Their armor seemed to weigh them down instead of protecting them. And their battlefield experience became useless against an army that was being supernaturally empowered by the God of Israel, the iron chariots. That had been the source of Canaanite. Confidence were now scattered across the muddy battlefield like broken toys. Some were overturned, others were stuck so deep in the mud that their crews had abandoned them completely. The sight of these supposedly invincible war machines, rendered helpless by rain and mud, must have been incredibly encouraging to Israel's advancing army. As the reality of their situation became clear, Sisera's forces began to break ranks and run. What had started as an organized military formation quickly became a mob of frightened men trying to save their own lives. The army that had marched confidently into battle was now fleeing in panic, abandoning their weapons and equipment as they ran. The Israelites pressed their advantage, pursuing the enemy with the determination that came from knowing God had delivered their oppressors into their hands. After 20 years of living in fear of these same soldiers, they now had the opportunity to ensure that their families would never have to be afraid again. They chased the fleeing Canaanites with the knowledge that this was divine justice finally being served. The pursuit wasn't just about military victory, it was about complete liberation. As long as any of Sisera's army remained organized and dangerous, they could regroup and return to terrorize Israel again. But God's plan was for total victory, ensuring that this threat would be eliminated permanently so his people could live in peace. The battlefield became a scene of absolute triumph for Israel and complete devastation for their enemies. The army that had seemed invincible just hours before was now scattered and broken, their power destroyed by the same God who had delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt centuries earlier. When Sisera realized that his entire army was being destroyed and that defeat was inevitable, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The mighty commander who had terrorized Israel for 20 years abandoned his iron chariot and began running for his life on foot. The man who had been the symbol of Canaanite power was now just another frightened soldier trying to escape from God's judgment. According to Judges 4:15, Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot as his army was being completely routed. This wasn't a strategic withdrawal or an organized retreat. This was pure panic. The commander, who had never known defeat, was experiencing the terror that his victims had felt for 2 decades. Except now, he was the one being hunted. His flight took him away from the main roads, where he might be recognized and captured by pursuing Israelites. Instead, he headed toward the hills, where he hoped to find someone willing to hide him from his enemies. In his desperation, he remembered that there were some non-Israelite families in the area who had maintained peaceful relationships with King Jabin's government. The irony of his situation was overwhelming. The man whose iron chariots had made travel dangerous for ordinary Israelites was now the one afraid to use the roads. The commander, who had made others flee in terror, was now experiencing that same terror himself. God's justice was being served in the most personal way possible. As Sisera ran, he was probably thinking about how quickly everything had changed. Just that morning, he had been confident of victory, certain that his superior military force would crush Israel's rebellion permanently. Now his army was destroyed, his chariots were useless, and he was running for his life through unfamiliar territory. His destination was the tent of Heber the Kenite, whose family had maintained peaceful relations with the Canaanite government. The Kenites were nomadic people who tried to stay neutral in the conflicts between different nations, trading with everyone and fighting with no one. In Sisera's desperate mind, this seemed like his best chance for sanctuary, but Sisera had no way of knowing that he was running straight toward the fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy. When she had told Barak that the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman, she hadn't been speaking about herself or any female warrior in Israel's army. She had been referring to a woman named Jael, who was waiting in a tent not far from where Sisera was now fleeing. As the exhausted commander approached what he hoped would be safety, he was actually walking into the final act of God's perfect plan for Israel's complete liberation from Canaanite oppression. When the exhausted and desperate Sisera arrived at the tent of Heber the Kenite, he was met by Heber's wife, Jael. She immediately recognized who he was, the feared commander of Canaan's army, the man whose name had struck terror into hearts throughout the region for 20 years. But instead of being afraid, she saw an opportunity to play a crucial role in Israel's divine victory. Jael welcomed Sisera into her tent with the kind of hospitality that was expected in their culture. She offered him protection and comfort, acting like someone who was honored to help such an important military leader. Her behavior gave no hint of what she was planning to do once he let his guard down completely. The Bible records their interaction in Judges 4:18-19. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink and covered him up. Sisera asked for water, but Jael gave him milk instead, a gesture that seemed even more generous and hospitable. Milk was more nourishing than water and would help restore his strength after the long, desperate flight from the battlefield. To Sisera, this seemed like evidence that he had found a safe haven where he could rest and recover. Feeling secure under Jael's protection and exhausted from the disaster he had just experienced, Sisera quickly fell into a deep sleep. The stress of losing his entire army, the physical exertion of his desperate escape, and the relief of finding apparent safety all combined to make him unconscious to everything around him. He had no idea that his sleep would be permanent. While Sisera slept, believing himself safe, Jael quietly picked up a tent peg and a hammer, tools that every nomadic woman knew how to use expertly. Setting up and taking down tents was part of daily life for people like the Kenites, and driving tent pegs securely into the ground required both skill and strength. Jael had done this countless times before, but never for a purpose like this. With careful precision, she drove the tent peg through Sisera's temple and into the ground beneath, killing him instantly. Judges 4:21 describes the moment, but Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. In that single decisive action, Jael fulfilled Deborah's prophecy that God would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. The mighty commander who had terrorized Israel for 2 decades was dead, killed not by a warrior's sword or a soldier's spear, but by a tent peg wielded by a woman who understood that God's justice needed to be served. When Barak arrived at Heber's tent in pursuit of Sisera, he had no idea that the final chapter of Israel's victory had already been written. He was still searching for the enemy commander, hoping to capture or kill the man who had caused so much suffering for God's people. But Jael was ready for him with news that would complete the fulfillment of everything God had promised through Deborah. Jael came out to meet Barak, and her words must have been shocking to hear. As recorded in Judges 4:22, she said, "Come, I will show you the man you're looking for." When she led him into the tent, there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead and no longer a threat to anyone. The sight must have been incredible for Barak to process. The man who had been the source of Israel's terror for 20 years, the commander whose iron chariots had made life miserable for countless families, was lying dead in a tent, killed by a woman with a simple tent peg. It was both the end of a nightmare and the fulfillment of divine prophecy in ways no one could have imagined. This moment completed Deborah's earlier prophecy in perfect detail. She had told Barak that because he insisted on her coming with him to battle, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. At the time, many might have assumed she was talking about herself. But God's plan had been even more unexpected than that. The honor of killing Israel's greatest enemy had gone not to the commanding general, not to any soldier in the army, and not even to the prophetess who had received God's battle plan. It had gone to a nomadic woman who wasn't even an Israelite, demonstrating once again that God's ways are completely different from human expectations and traditions. Sisera's death by tent peg rather than sword also symbolized how completely God had turned the tables on Israel's oppressors. This wasn't a glorious death in battle. It was an inglorious end that matched the inglorious way Sisera had treated his victims for so many years. The man who had shown no mercy would receive none in return. With Sisera dead and his army completely destroyed, Israel's victory was total and complete. The threat that had hung over them for 20 years was permanently removed. Families could live without fear. Children could play safely. Merchants could travel freely. And farmers could work their fields without worrying about enemy soldiers stealing their crops. The battle that had begun with what looked like impossible odds had ended, with the most complete victory anyone could have imagined. Not a single enemy soldier remained to threaten Israel again, and their supposedly invincible commander was dead, killed by a woman with a tent peg. God had demonstrated once again that when he fights for his people, victory is certain regardless of how impossible the situation might appear to human eyes. If this incredible story of faith, courage, and divine victory has inspired you, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join our community of Bible story explorers. Share this video with your friends and family. They need to hear how God turns impossible situations into amazing victories just as much as you did. And don't forget to check out our other biblical adventures in the playlist below. Until next time, remember, when God is on your side, no enemy is too strong, no situation is too hopeless, and no victory is too impossible. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next story.